This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Guiding in the government, basically major project and the technical advancement. Actually, I don't know how official this is. I have as well worked on a lot of his reviews and frameworks that they have developed. So you probably came across VIDAS and some of the risk assessment tools and as well our business case evaluation. So that came actually out of the office that Luke led. And here is Luke. This is super timing. Wonderful. Luke, how are you doing?
Good, thanks. Sorry, I'm a little bit late.
Yeah, no worries. So maybe I hand then over in a second to you.
Okay.
If you want, I can
sure.
give you the floor, because as I mentioned, we have just 2 times 45 minutes. It was a bad indicator from me indicating that you have 3 hours.
No,
but,
I thought that was going to be a long lecture, so
yes.
I'm glad it's quite short.
Yeah, but I was just saying, so in terms of context, so we are kind of halfway through the semester. Today we are coming to the advanced project management side.
Okay.
And I've already pitched you very high as having kind of been in your role of leading as well the transformation of project management and infrastructure.
Yes.
And that is, I think, where I mentioned as well that you are alumni, I think, from here.
Yes.
I guessed from the picture, but I'm spoiling here already things.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hand over. Can we welcome Luke in the usual manner? Thank you, Luke. I give you the slides, so
yes.
here, and then you can do either slides here or here. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Here, Luke.
And if I remember rightly, afternoon classes at university are always a bit hard to get going, especially after lunch. So we'll try and make this as a little bit more interactive as possible, so I can gauge where you're at, and also you can get the most out of it for this as well. So a bit about me. So I went to Melbourne Uni. I studied mechanical engineering and computer science. I remember this lecture theatre very fondly. They've updated the seating, but that seems about it. There's still computer labs upstairs, and maybe not. Anyway, so there's me graduating down the bottom there from Melbourne Uni many years ago. What I liked about engineering was the ability to solve problems. I really liked physical problems which had a complexity to it that people needed engineering skill set to solve, and that's what really got me going, and that's where I chose a career in engineering. I initially started working in the petrochem industry, so working as a mechanical engineer, doing piping design, which is very complex, and I guess probably the most complex out of the petrochem industry, and that was in everything from offshore vessels, so thinking about all the different load conditions and things like that with rotating equipment, pressure vessels, piping, and through to ammonium nitrate facilities. Everyone remembers what happened in Lebanon with ammonium nitrate stored in their port, and how dangerous that is, and how there's a huge focus on risk and project management and innovation in that industry. Coming up to the global financial crisis, that industry didn't do so well. So I worked at a company, probably had about 900 people in Melbourne. Globally, it was part of a bigger company that had about 300,000 employees. It was ThyssenKrupp, if you've ever heard of it, big German company. And so I had a choice then to go, and I also worked, so I should have said, I also worked as in design, but also in construction. And that's also something that I recommend highly to anyone in this industry. So it's really important to work in design and really important to work in construction and go between the two, because that way you really understand what you're designing and how it gets built, and what the people on the construction site do to what gets built, and the dynamics at play there too. So it makes you a much better engineer, and leads to better project outcomes as well. So looking at a shift in my career, I thought to work in the water industry. Very similar to process industry. So I took a role on as a project manager. And I should say that when I started in the petrochem industry, I remember in my job interview very clearly that they said to me, "Oh, what do you want to do in 5 years?" And I said, "Oh, I'll be a project manager." And there was this old Scottish guy there, and he goes, "Well, project manager in this industry, son, manages a team of over 300 people. Good luck." But in the water industry, it's very different, and we'll get to that. Like each industry has their different nuances and different sizes of projects and different nomenclature for who they call what. So getting to the water industry, I also started studying a Masters of Business Administration at ANU as well, and took on a role in the water industry. Now, why I'm talking so slowly about this is because moving from petrochem to water, it was really obvious on the differences in project management maturity and also the engineering capability. Water, I guess it doesn't matter so much if there's a burst or a leak. They'll get to it eventually. It might, unless it's flooding someone's house, but you know, if there's a leak, it may be leaking for 20 years and it doesn't really matter. Whereas in the petrochem industry, if it leaks, you better hope it doesn't leak in the first place, but if it does leak, then people are right onto it. So there's different levels of risk and management and capability when it goes between two different industries. So working as a project manager, I got pretty frustrated, well, not necessarily frustrated, but I could see a lot of opportunities for how they could improve how they delivered on their projects, from everything from an engineering perspective to a risk perspective, but even to standardising designs or to thinking about how do you plan out your works. So I quickly moved into and realised I had a bit of a passion for the change aspect of what we work in this industry. So transformation of how teams actually deliver work. How does an organisation improve itself to deliver on its objectives? So by the time I'd finished in the water industry, I was probably one of 13 project managers, managing a third of the project portfolio, and also taking on a role as a business improvement manager. So really trying to lift their capability and capacity. One of the projects I was managing won an award. It was actually a pretty cool thing. It was a 9-story furnace because I was working in Canberra, and so they don't have anywhere to naturally let out their wastewater, so they have to do something with the solids. And so they have a 9-story furnace that deals with the solids, and the water that goes, the water needs to be purified to such an extent that it's drinkable water, and that goes into a river system. So you can imagine that. But we actually, they were looking at spending some money on this clunky old 9-story furnace because it was exceeding its air emissions, and it was also exceeding, it was just a bit old and using a lot of diesel and was very inefficient. So we actually did a CFD of the furnace, and we used advanced control theory to work out the whole of the process plant and be able to, with the view to thinking, well, how do we automate this? So that was a really interesting project and something that really took the people in that company to a while to get their heads around, but it was successful and did move forward, because if you ever work with operators, it's almost like they have it's a way of being operating. One operator likes to turn its knobs this way, another one does it this way, and they all have this sort of mystique for the machinery that they're managing. And so you can get some very different outcomes, and if you change between shifts, between operators, you can see the output varies greatly, and that's really important when you need to think about engineering and building and construction asset management. So moving into a business improvement field and transformation, because it's for fixing physical problems is great, but fixing people problems, I would say, is better, and where a lot of the challenges need to be. So fixing the the resistance to change, how you can do something differently, how do you plan out, how do you improve what you're doing. And that took me to a career in management consulting, working for Ernst & Young and PwC. I did everything from working on strategy implementation for Lend-Lease, on how they build operational business units in terms of utilities, through to working on mines, through to working on in a milk factory in Auckland, where we were there to lift the productivity of their operation facilities. And we did that. We lifted their operating facilities from 45% efficient up to 70% efficient. And that was massive for them. And Fonterra is their biggest company in New Zealand, I should say. Through to audit, through to many different things, and I was exposed to a lot of different theory and practice and different thinkers and industries, which is really interesting, because if you see different industries, and I only talked about going from petrochem to water, that's where a lot of the innovations and the smarts come from. You can grab one thing from one industry, apply it to another. They all look at things in a slightly different way. So it's really important to see that and experience that. But it was also my first experience working for government projects. Previously I thought, oh, government projects, come on, a bit slow, a bit clunky, they all wear cardigans. No, not true. Really interesting projects, really massive, really big. So I happened to come across a role in the Premier's department. I worked at Premier and Cabinet for a number of years, where I was the lead advisor on major projects, and getting to understand how decisions get made on infrastructure was a really interesting learning journey for me, and one where it takes a bit of time to understand, because engineering, you're there to solve a problem. It's almost like a linear path. You see the risks and you work out how to navigate that. With the political dimension, it's a completely different way of looking at a problem. And that's where you can see, if you ever work in civil infrastructure for government projects, you need to apply a different set of logic from just your project management. I'm here to deliver it on this. Scope, quality, cost. Yep, I've got that fixed. Off we go. Government projects are very different like that. They can often focus on the time aspect. No, we need to deliver it by here. Then everything else is flexible. We'll cut the scope, or we'll just throw money at it, or we'll throw people at it to get it done. We'll solve along the way. Or coming up to the annual budget cycle, understanding how different projects got up and got going. It's not always obvious, and why some didn't. So for instance, some critical maintenance projects never got up. So you think about Vic Roads funding, or for their maintenance, they always had to come up every year, and it's like 300 million every year in maintenance funding, and they had to justify what they were doing and put in a lot of detail. Or you'd have some facility that was on the almost close to breaking point, and they still didn't get funding. Or they had a radio system that they were borrowing parts from developing countries, and the developing countries had even changed their technology, and this was just stuff that they had in the warehouse and we're still operating these infrastructure assets. And so it was very interesting working in the Premier's department, very reactive, and that's where I thought there was an opportunity to change that and work on more of the proactive things. And I took a role in Treasury and Finance, working then for the Chief Engineer. It was a very short introduction, 6 months. Before then, I was the acting Chief Engineer due to her health reasons, but it certainly was a baptism by fire, but really interesting. So I was a Chief Engineer for just over 4 years, and got involved in everything from, say, in the middle, implementation of the registration of engineers scheme. So engineering registration, not really a thing across the world. Queensland does it, but yeah, does it really do it? And so having to write into public policy, physical documents, give guidance on how engineers operate and not just how they do that, but you think about the complexities of it. It's not just mechanical, civil, chemical, you know, the traditional things. Different industries, you overlay that with different industries, and so people call themselves mining engineers, people call themselves water engineers. The abundance of different engineering identities is amazing, and then you try and define that in terms of the context of the difference between a technician or an electrician or whatever, and you can easily see why a Clean Energy Council CEO would be writing to me and saying you're stopping or the progress of the climate change, and we need to resolve these issues, or a number of different things. So there's that. Metro Tunnel, as we're in construction. Really interesting project. Takes a long time to get a project like that off the ground. I think it took 8 years before it was actually a business case. Went between so many different solutions, and then in the delivery of it, there were many complex decisions and many different challenges there, and that really speaks to the sort of the cutting edge between engineering, commercial, working in government, the different complexities there, and the different appreciation from the ministers who are ultimately making these decisions around how to tackle that. And that's why it's really important for engineers to be able to speak clearly and articulate what exactly a problem is in the language that someone else can understand. That's in Canberra. This is one of those things that the Treasurer asks you to do, and you do it. So this is a focus on indoor air quality after COVID, and the engineering aspects of indoor air quality in terms of public health. And so we did a whole lot of work around that as well. And here we are with, if you know where is he? Jason Monty, just up there, and Robin Schofield's in there as well, so some Melbourne Uni academics in that crowd, as well as everyone probably recognises Brett Sutton with his mask on, and a few others. So we were there to talk about indoor air quality and what we could do to improve public health. So the role and the experience that I had was vast, from everything from indoor air quality through to mouldy buildings, through to schools, through to major infrastructure. You name it, we were doing it. We're also trying to transform how government delivered its infrastructure, so we had a whole huge transformation program that we managed to get funding for too, and that wasn't a mean feat. Anyway, that's a bit about me, and sorry for taking a bit of time, but I think the context is important. So today we'll just go through a couple of examples of one complex project that I've got there and a little bit of a snapshot. Some of the project leadership behaviours I think that can help with complex projects, and the way of thinking that's really important, and some project execution options as well, because that works into the complexity and the how do you simplify things as well. So I guess I just wanted to reiterate, my role is to help you learn, hopefully give some level of inspiration, helps you reflect on the course material, and help you guide the learning process, and hopefully it's a good session. So something a little bit interactive, I'd just like to see from everyone in the room, maybe a show of hands, where do you place yourself in terms of experience of major project or general management practice? So I'll just go through novice. Anyone here a novice? Okay. Advanced, beginner? Yep. Okay. Somewhat competent? Good. Proficient? No? Expert? No? Well, I guess this is a master subject, so we're all learning, right? That's good to know in terms of how to pitch it, pitch what we're going through. And it's really important to take that into the context of, if you are going to be a master builder, it requires a combination of both practice and theory. So I know there's often a debate that, you know, especially if you work with some of the operators or construction people, they always talk about experience and, you know, this fresh engineer or this fresh management masters, or, you know, this, oh, you've got a master's in construction management. Oh, okay, get back. But really, it's the combination of the two that really leads you to be able to develop those really wonderful, high-functioning projects. So, you know, practice, you can be a learning expert. There's a lot of people will tell you if you go work in industry, and they'll say, oh, another shiny ass. Okay, all right. And until you prove yourself, they treat you like that. Or if you're a knowledge of theory, a potential bore, because you don't have any of that practical experience or case studies to plant in there. But as I'm sure you're aware, in reality, you may have a plan, but there'll be many lows and highs, and that's where the lows and the highs are good learning experiences as well, and where you should think about the theory that you've learnt and how it could apply in your situation, or in fact if there is no theory on it, or there's no learning that you see from those experiences, how could you then create something to help others and help the profession? So a bit of a personal objective of mine, at least, and was my role as the chief engineer as well as in the Premier's department. We so many times, in so many different jurisdictions, projects go over time, over budget, under benefits, over and over again. I'm sure if you have been an avid reader of what's happening in government projects, let alone what's happening in the private side of the projects industry as well. Though it's the private side often turn about return on investment, shareholder value, but certainly there's been some colossal mistakes of projects in the private sector that have cost a lot of money and gone nowhere. So where we want to go is on time, on budget, the benefits every time. Anyone heard of Crossrail in the UK? Yep, okay, we've got one person. Crossrail is one of those projects. It's a great case study because it's over, it says 2010 to 2018 on that slide, but really it started a long time before that. And it's one of those things that government policy land that the government sits on until there's enough community expectations or support that they actually do something with it, and it's not going to burn them or risk, or the risk to them burning are minimal. And one of those things that helps get Crossrail off the ground is, for instance, a lot of London businesses actually said that they contribute money towards the project, which is one of the first instances of what you call value creation and value capture, because they saw the benefits of greater transport infrastructure for their businesses to thrive, and so they really wanted it. So the project at a glance, well, Crossrail, they wanted new trains to carry 200 million passengers a year, reduce journey times to, I think, 45 minutes, increase the capital's rail capacity by 10%. So it was 10 new stations and improve 31 stations. Create up to 14,000 construction jobs. I mean, also I should say that when government says 14,000 construction jobs, they don't go and actually measure everyone's payslip or who's on site, and they're always a huge assumption in terms of these jobs. That's where economists come in. I was always debating with economists around actually what is this, and it'd be great to have some real numbers rather than your multipliers to different types of infrastructure that you use, because that's often sold as why you do projects in a government sense. It's about job creation, the economy, making sure that you're getting an economic outlift from the expenditure, not just the services or the benefits that you're going to deliver at the end of the day. And so I was going to bring an extra 1.5 million people to within 45 minutes of central London. and 42 billion was the cost in pounds, which is an astronomical sum. Probably still less than the suburban railway, but still an astronomical sum of money. I think I've already explained that, and that's just a bit of the details. It's probably not going to be useful, but a bit more interactive. So it's.
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
Who were the businesses that pitched in? I know they picked some up along the way, but,
Yes.
but that reminded me of this.
There were. It was the Chamber of Commerce in London, and they. I think each of the stations had a different district. Like some of the jewelry districts, some of the like so there's, if you think about it, it joins up, goes straight through. It joins up. Well, it's now the Elizabeth line. If anyone's ever travelled on it, that went straight through the centre of London, and yeah, a lot of those smaller businesses came together to then fund it. A bit like so when the Melbourne Underground rail loop came into existence, that was funded partially through your water rates, partially through the City of Melbourne, and a lot of businesses actually came together to fund it as well, which is something that government is very shy on doing these days. No one likes to pay more, so it's often easier to do tolls, for instance, or to put it in the huge debt that the state's got at the moment. Yeah.
I just remember there was this where I think BT and City of London, and
Yes.
that was for the Olympic bid, right?
Yeah.
So I think that was clustered actually in, or there were some. I'm not sure that they really paid, but they gave definitely credit, and then had licensing rights that were.
Yes. Yeah. I think the funding only came to about 3% of the total project cost, but yeah, it's still something, and was still seen as a successful case study on, people paying for a project in their local vicinity, apart from what governments usually do and putting tolls in after the fact, or putting in a massive fare. So, for instance, a lot of rail airport projects, for instance, you often pay a lot of money to go to the airport on rail, and so that's a lot more expensive, and that's how they make their money. So Andrew Woolstenholme, CEO of Crossrail. It's 2010, so just the beginning of the project. What do you think he should be thinking about or worried about at the start of the project? I mean, you think about this big project that you've been given, there's such a big timeline and lead up to it. It's required legislation to pass through government, through both houses and government. There's needed a business case that's been written for such a long time, and it's been hugely deliberated. And now this gentleman here has been given the project to run. What do you think he's concerned about? Yep.
For political will, I think around the times like post-GFC in the UK, a lot of austerity and stuff, so the chance of being axed.
Yeah, I mean that's always a huge concern of any government projects. Are they going to deliver all of it? Are they only going to deliver some of it? Is it going to be completely axed? I mean, everyone probably remembers East West Link. That was completely axed after spending, I think, 1.3 billion. Any others?
Stakeholder expectations?
Yeah, that's really important. What do you think? What do you think would be the most concerning about what the stakeholders would want?
Does the project brings its own benefit to all the stakeholders involved?
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of stakeholders on these type of projects, they go, you promised to be delivered by this date. My business is waiting on this. I've set up a new business right where your station is. I expect foot traffic to come through day one. Am I going to have it, or am I going to be left with a business that I can't sell any goods from? Or what are the stations going to look like? I may be a disabled person in a wheelchair. Am I be able to use this station? Can I get through efficiently? or will the the lift's be right back in the corner, and I can't access it that efficiently, and it'll take 20 minutes for me to get on the train. Like, any others?
And he will be just monitoring, wouldn't he? Like, he wouldn't be actually doing the risk or the community engagement or...
It's down to him. He's the CEO. I've seen lots of CEOs actually front up to mayors, ministers' offices, local community groups. He's the CEO, but he has it's a 42 billion is a massive amount of money. It's almost like what would be a big company in the UK. And you think about a big company CEO, there is an expectation that he shows up. Most of the time he's probably thinking about how to please or how to serve his minister. Making sure that the public perception of the project is on track, but also at the back of his mind he's thinking, how do we make sure that this project's going to be delivered when we said it would be delivered, that we're not going to end up with huge risks, that it's all going to go smoothly. And a project this size, always has huge risks.
When he construct the rail, does the Crossrail do by themselves, or they appoint the subcontractors to do it?
They will have many subcontractors.
So I think one of the most concerning for the CEO is can they manage the contractor well or not? Because I think it's the very, very important side. When I was the owner side, I always thinking about that every day. How can I manage them well?
Yeah. How do you make sure that you're paying them what they should be paid to do the job that they said they'd do? And you don't have, ghost shifts, or, people doing stuff that they said they'd do. Or, for instance, I'm sure you've heard in the media about, say, Melbourne Metro, where they ran into some issues and they had to give the contractor an extra $2 billion. Make sure you don't end up in those type of situations.
Are superintendents always present on mega and major projects?
You most likely will have many superintendents for different areas. They'll split the project up into different areas for ease of management. Most likely that will align with the contract. So, for instance, on Melbourne Metro, there's the tunnels and stations package. There's the Rail Infrastructure Alliance. There's a Rail Signal Alliance, and then the trains were procured separately as well. I've seen the contracting map for Crossrail. It is hugely complex, and we could talk about it all day. Because you imagine how many moving parts there are. So there's 5 new stations, but there's 31 revamped stations, and there's a significant amount of tunnel infrastructure that needs to go through. Any other questions or thoughts?
Do you reckon it would be better to deliver it through multiple separate projects that connect together instead of having one very complex?
Yeah, this is always a thought. It's almost like, how do you build a work breakdown structure?
Yeah.
So how do you build it in such a way that you minimise the risks or overlaps or dependencies on others? So you're thinking about clear execution, because you want to do as many tasks in parallel, so you need to do that efficiently. So you need to work out what are all your tasks that you need to do that depend on each other in series, and see, well, how can you put them all together that there are enough parallel things that you can create a contract package out of it. So if you're doing, like, for instance, getting someone to do the tunnel and the station, that seems pretty separate and unique and leads to less risk, except when the people coming in to fit out the tunnel, but those that would be hard to sort of remove that risk. So yeah, so you have to think about in terms of the logic of it is really important, and trying to minimise any sort of dependencies or rework. When you create multiple projects, you create multiple overlaps. So if you think about the rail network in Melbourne, there's many different projects occurring at the moment, and I've seen Melbourne Metro overlap on level crossings, it's overlapping on another project, overlapping on something else, which leads to then miscommunication, potential for miscommunication, and the wrong things being installed. Not just once, twice, or sometimes they install the wrong thing 4 times. And that's costly and embarrassing, and no one wants to hear that story. Everyone wants to hear they did it once and they did it well, and everyone was in great communication and agreement around what that was. Because at the other side of that complexity, it's not just different projects are at different stages of their maturity. So some projects haven't even started their design, while some projects are well through their design. The department who are supposed to owning the standards, they might not have a standard on that, and they're relying on the project to come up to speed on that. So you can understand how all these problems get created. Yeah.
Just extending on that, is it because, well, is it split up depending on whether the project can be delivered in isolated stages that would deliver their own benefits?
That's also,
where
yeah.
Everything needs to be done at once to actually deliver the benefit.
Not always the case. So if you see the Melbourne Metro business case, they use a overall benefit. So they acknowledge that the tunnel is sort of an enabler for the benefits, but then they need to do all these other infrastructure upgrades to actually get the number that they need for the benefits. And the benefits are usually, calculated by economists. They'll do some modelling, and it'll all be based on the capital cost, and the modelling. And by the way, no one ever goes back and checks that. I think in the UK, which is really important. The UK have a huge focus on it, but I don't think they do it throughout as well as they could be. Because you think about scoping decisions, you think about the variables of cost, quality and time. Any of those things can have an impact on the benefit. And that changes. Like government, often on these big projects, you need some flexibility in terms of where can you put more money in, scope it differently. And usually community expectations means that you get a really, well, most of the time, I've seen others, but the outcome that you get is really high quality because they're trying to appease as many stakeholders as possible. And that's where you get, level crossing removal authority program, for instance, having these really wonderful stations that before it was just, very simple and no one really used, or it was very simple. And now you have a station that could be in the middle of the city. So he's got a lot on his mind, and he rightly should do. So don't envy him, but he will have a team surrounding him. But often these projects start up, and they'll appoint a CEO first, and then the CEO and the board and the minister's department or the department will then slowly grow the team. And then sometimes, like in the instance of Suburban Rail, like I was on the DPC project team. You can have 5 different project teams all working on this one project until it all comes together and they decide who the minister is, and then they work out all the other issues. Okay. So this gets into sort of the context setting, the theory, a bit of philosophy. So Isaiah Berlin wrote this essay on the hedgehog and the fox in 1953. It's kind of an interesting perspective. So the context is that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. So to be a CEO of Crossrail, do you think it's needing a fox mentality or a hedgehog mentality?
Hedgehog.
A hedgehog? Fox. Need to know many different things. many different things, and you'll have many different fronts. So a hedgehog goes in it's almost like a civil engineer or a planner or a stakeholder engagement person, or has worked up their technical expertise and honed it to an nth of its life, and is extremely capable in doing that. While the fox likes to see things from the big picture, managing risk, and trying to place all those different hedgehogs below them. So that's where you get things like the theory of systems engineering coming out. So systems engineering is all about integrating different hedgehogs together, so to speak, and trying to think it through in that perspective. A lot of industries don't actually have a thing called systems engineering. It's most prevalent in civil infrastructure. I guess that's because civil engineers have been the predominant engineering workforce that deliver those projects. But now you're getting a lot more technical complexity there with electrical systems, signaling systems, mechanical equipment. And when you start to create many different forms of disciplines and expertise, that's where you need something to pull it all together, and that's where systems engineering has a play. So this is, there is actually a little clip. Does the clip thing work?
Yeah, it did work. Just click it.
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
We're back, and this time I've got this little fox. So I've got this little fox for my. It revolves around a fox. Now it's an old Greek parable where it says the fox knows many things a lot, but the hedgehog knows one big thing, and that's the key here, because as we fast forward into, I think it was like the mid-1950s, there was this great philosopher. His name was Isaiah Berlin, and he says, look, in an essay, he says, the hedgehog and the fox. And in that essay, he specified, he said, look, the fox can do a lot of things, but what I want you to do is I want you to focus in and be like the hedgehog. The hedgehog can do one thing extremely well. See, Berlin referred back to the Greek parable, and he said the fox can leap, it can prance, it can go around and sneak up on the hedgehog. It can do it a lot of different ways, but the hedgehog can do one thing extremely well, and that's defend itself. No matter what, it's going to roll up into a ball, and at the end, the fox is going to have prickly stuff all over its body, and so the same thing applies to you. In that same way, don't be the fox that's scattered and goes to this shiny object and then goes over here and says, I want to do this, no, I want to do that. Be more like the hedgehog who says, what am I amazing at? What am I great at? And dive in deeper into that. Now, Jim Collins also said in the early 2000s when he wrote,
Yeah, that probably gives you the some of it. There we go. So you need both, but to be the CEO of Crossrail, you need to be that fox. You need to have that mentality that takes in all those different disciplines. And that's often where you see failures in projects, is where the CEO or the project leader or someone significant enough in a project just is sort of single-tracked minded about how something should deliver. They're using their years of experience, so they might have a predominant, being a civil engineer and graduated through to the ranks, but not really understanding the stakeholder stuff or the planning stuff or all the different things required to deliver on a project. So the fox is curious, knows many things. It can make the best out of that sort of expertise. And this is where you get into, the many fronts of a major project. So this is what Andrew, the CEO of Crossrail, will be thinking about. So how do you set up your organisation and governance right up front? And governance is really important as well. So setting up those many different, it may seem like a burden, but setting up the governance committee, so that means the meetings where decisions are made and making sure that flows seamlessly and it works well, because you need that to be successful. You need that to tell your board and the ministers and everyone else when things are going wrong and what you're proposing to fix them, and what options there are to deliver on the project to fix a complexity or an issue, or even just to give them transparency of where things are up to, what's the current number of stations being delivered, what's the number of stakeholders that have been engaged, where are the different issues coming out of. Really important to understand the governance and make sure that those stakeholders are bought in, because if they're standing up in front of the media, they can't go, well, the project did this and I had no idea what they were doing. How many times do you hear ministers say that? And they'll look for the fall guy or girl. Hire good people and invest in their capabilities. Get your processes right. Processes are extremely important. You may think of a project as a single endeavour and is unique, but the art of project management, the science of project management is repeatable, and you should be applying those repeatable processes to your project in the context of your project. Get your technology systems right. There's so many frustrating technologies and systems that don't work, that hard to use. Working in the petrochem industry, they're at least 30 years ahead of civil infrastructure industry in terms of what they do and how they function in terms of technology and systems, and I'm not joking. Engineers Australia Excellence Award was given to a project I was working on in 2004. The civil infrastructure project has only some projects have only done this year. And that was mapping a brownfield asset, so then they can extend it or augment it, so then they could tie it in properly and understand how to do that properly. And the technology's there. Get your upfront project design and estimates right. Think about the optioneering. Scalability is always good as well. So think about what's the thing that the minimum you can do to meet some of the benefits to the maximum you can do. That's always great. And also do this thing called benefit mapping. So put your scope down one side, your benefits across the top, and then look at where those boxes intersect and actually who'll use the scope to get you those benefits, because it's always like that people and technology divide. And then you can say, oh, that part of my scope gives me these really great things, or that part of my scope enables me to do these other benefits, and then you can clearly go to the rationale behind why we need something versus something else. Get your internal and external communications right, and establish the commercial partnerships and stakeholder relationships as well. Like market sound is really important. So for instance, a lot of these big projects, they have to put into smaller packages because the market's not ready to accept a $20 billion project. They can only afford to do a $4 billion project, for instance. And that's about the company's risk appetite to deliver on something, not necessarily about their capability. A major project life cycle. Well, there are lots of different models, and as you can see up on the board, they're all the acronyms to them, but essentially you start off with an idea. You think about how that idea could be delivered and what benefits you need. Or it could be starting off with a problem and going, okay, we've got an issue, we've got huge gridlock in one part of the city. It'd be great to build a freeway or build a transportation system that delivers that infrastructure, that relieves that burden. So there's optioneering, and then that optioneering will be a policy decision. You can go up to government, for instance, and go, or the minister, and go, what do you prefer? There's many ways to deal with this problem. And they might go, oh, we'll build a freeway. And so then you go, well, what's the engineering, the construction, and then the commissioning. And all around that, there'll be different parts to planning, there'll be different contracts that you'll put in place. And the contracts that you put in place are down below. So for instance, on Melbourne Metro, the tunnel and stations package, that was a public-private partnership, which meant that the government would be paying, after the project delivered it, availability payments to the contractor or the consortium that would ultimately own it for a certain period of time. It's a way also to get a lot of the project costs off the government's balance sheet, and so there's reasons for that. And then there's other simple things like alliances, which just brings different parties to come together, and there's contractual arrangements in place to make sure that you're getting the most out of different parties. And then there's simple things like construct only, construct management. You could speak all day about delivery models, and I'm sure you'll hear it from a legal person or a lawyer. They have their preferences. I can tell you the risks of all of the different ones, and so that's important to know in terms of the context around how you're delivering your project, because they all have different. It's set to different context how you manage it. So is it the contractor owning more of the risk? Does the state own the risk? Does the subcontractors own the risk? And it's all around how do you understand that risk in the context of it. How do you minimise the risk? So thinking through what sort of engineering design or what other mitigation measures you can put in place before you go out to contract, and also planning and public perception. So there's many, it's a complex area, but it's basically still delivering on the same things as design, construct. Now there's the things that you can think about what makes Crossrail a major project in terms of why is it a major project rather than a simple project. And you can think about this in terms of the physical, the inputs required, the financial outlay, the supply measured, demand being served, the temporality nature of it, spatial fixity, the complexity, or the impact. But I guess a rough rule of thumb is, and we'll get to the dollar signs of it, dollars usually speak to complexity, because you need a lot of, if you're doing something big, you need a lot of money to spend on it. But saying that, there's a lot of complex projects that are small, but they're usually technically complex. So, I don't know, a refinery upgrade might cost 200 million, which is small in the context of a civil infrastructure project, but that 200 million requires a lot of people and a lot of engineers to actually deliver on it, and it can be hugely complex. So, yeah, just a simple measure. And what academics and industry usually say is a major program or mega projects in the billions, major projects hundreds of millions, large project tens of millions, and a project is in millions or thousands. In fact, the Victorian government's high value, high risk framework does a bit of a risk versus value perspective, and they usually say if it's 250 mil and higher with high risk, it's a high value, high risk. If it's 500 mil, it definitely is, and anything over that in terms of dollars is a high value, high risk project, complex. And the reason that is important in terms of that categorisation is because it has a different level of rigour. It has a different level of oversight, it has a different level of governance. Usually has a lot more audits and assurance in terms of what's happening on the ground, and usually has the justification to spend more money on staff to manage the non-core project delivery elements. Yep.
Because of that threshold we were talking about, defining projects either under budget to get under that threshold or over budget to sort of reach that.
Yeah, some of them do, but I guess everyone loves to say that they worked on a bigger project. So they go, oh, I worked on a $500 million project. It's rare to see someone go, oh no, I only worked on a $249 million project. It was minor compared to these other projects. Some gaming is usually at the lower end. So for instance, there's a requirement for state government that a project under 10 million only requires a short form business case. So there's usually that level of playing, so anything over 10 million requires a long form business case and a lot more work. So that's where you usually see the sort of the fudging and the playing around the edges. That's a good question.
If the scope changes throughout the project then, and it goes over that 10 million,
Yeah.
for example, do they then have to do a long
It depends on if a decision's been made to fund the project. So usually those business cases go into a annual budget cycle. We're about to see one for, I think, in early May. So they'll get deliberated on every year, and they'll make a decision around funding. So if it gets a green light, it most likely won't revisit a business case. It'll go through another sort of committee structure that meets once a month, that can award the scope and the funds a different way. Yeah, that's a good question. And private companies usually wait to go to a shareholder meeting or have different delegations of authority in place. Yeah. And some might need their international partners or backers or thinking to go through.
Question.
Yeah.
So for what we classify this kind of scale, is there any effect with how we manage the project? Or is there any effect how we fund the project? Or this is just a name?
Yes and no. Well, it's always a challenge for anyone to fund a large project. Usually the funding is only written in terms of the what's recorded in terms of the next 4 years, because that's all that ever got made into the budget, budget papers. PPPs are slightly different in terms of how it gets recognised. But yeah, it's always a challenge to fund significant projects, and that's where a lot of countries or governments go into debt to fund these projects. So when governments talk about having a budget that's in surplus, they still have a debt. It's just that the expenditure on the debt is they're able to meet it's like being able to pay off your mortgage. If you needed to borrow more money every year to pay off your mortgage, then you're not in surplus. Okay. And I'd say that there's major projects across many different sectors, and you think about it in terms of physical infrastructure or even cyber infrastructure as well. There's projects. Projects are about transformation, transforming a business, transforming to a service, providing more services, growth. That's what projects do, and it's a big business. I think the amount of money being spent on global projects is in the vicinity of 6 to 9 trillion a year. That's a massive amount of money. It means there's a lot of opportunity to improve how we do that as well. So getting back to Crossrail, it's had a bit of a varied timeline. So it had a few different setbacks over 20 years. It took to deliver the project. That's a significant amount of time. 20 years. Who wants to think about a project that gets delivered over that sort of time frame? Certainly a minister that only is thinking about a re-election every 3 to 4 years is a bit nervous when you say 20 years. And so who knows, it may be a different political party that's taking the credit for this project when it gets opened. So there's many things to think about during that time. If you read the ins and outs of this, you'll see that, and I should say that Crossrail did a great job in capturing lessons learned. It was very transparent in that, but there are many sort of organisational issues that it had when delivering the project that let itself down. So for instance, when it first started to see some issues in the opening date being pushed back 12 months in 2010. 2014, the National Audit Office, who audit the projects, says it's just a little bit behind schedule. And you see this all the time in project land as well. We call them the watermelons. Green on the outside and red on the inside. Because it's often no one wants to take responsibility for a project that's failing or suffering some significant setbacks. So in 2015 they finished the tunnel boring. Then so they're laying the concrete, the track's being laid. And then in 2018 the rail minister says we've got an increase in our budget of 15.4 billion as cost pressures have increased across the project. How many times do you hear a minister talk about cost pressures? And they'll blame it on everything from COVID to war in Ukraine to the weather changing to who knows, anything really. And then in 2018, the Crossrail announces that they won't be opening on their opening day, and for a government project, that is pretty severe. And that's where you see this gentleman right here. He resigned, and all speculation says he resigned before. If he didn't resign, he would have been sacked. So it was a graceful exit because ultimately, as the chairman of the Crossrail board, so the government structure, he was responsible for overseeing what the CEO did, and ultimately the project was not healthy. And Mr. Terry, or Sir Terry Morgan, resigned because of that. A lot of you wind forward and it's 2023, and that's when the project is delivered to its full benefits and getting the 24 trains per hour scheduled to deliver the services. And you'll see a lot of, if you read about the history of this, it'll be things that they didn't anticipate. So it'll be usually things to do with the systems engineering side of things, the electrical substations, the signalling. They had a whole lot of issues in testing trains in the tunnel because you need to test trains before you open it up to public. Platform screen doors was a huge issue. You think about that, it's not just, they look pretty simple, but I remember being in the discussions in Melbourne Metro. I felt like you're talking about it all the time, in terms of how they open. Do they open with the doors of the train? How do we ensure they open with the doors of the train? How do you make sure that you're not going to trap someone in there? What if it's a child? Is that enough to be trapped inside there? Like, what are all the different risks and thinking around platform screen doors, which you think is something that's pretty simple. But no, there's a lot of things to think about. So they had a significant amount of issues. And this is typical of a major project. There's lots of complexities. Though in saying that, Mark Wild, who actually used to work in Victorian government before he went over to Crossrail, and he came back, when was it, 2 years ago, and I met him, and he's a very lovely guy, and he talked about all the things that Crossrail did right, and also the things it could have improved on. And so I think this is a sort of a rich legacy, and I'll just go through these clips very quickly because I think it's really important to the
Firstly,
context.
end dates. Fixed end dates are deadly. Crossrail fixed its end date of the 9th of December 2018 in 2008, 10 years hence, a fixed end date. And of course that really distorted behaviours in the project team. By the time we got to 2015-2016, 2 to 3 to 4 years from the end, the project was under immense pressure, which we'll talk about later. And the idea of a fixed end date, I think in retrospect, has been seen to be not really a very mature view of a mega digital program. Something like Crossrail is more akin to a big IT program rather than an infrastructure program in a lot of ways. And of course in IT agile programs, people talk about windows of uncertainty. And when I took this job over, one of the very first things we did was we kind of abandoned the concept of fixed terminal end dates and spoke more about windows of opportunity. So we converted our whole program to an early and late dates, windows. Internal project team to drive to the early date, but publicly explain to people why the range of uncertainty, the risks that could occur, to create an open window. And to this day, we say our opening window at the moment is between February next year and June next year. And we've narrowed that window down over the past 3 years. Now, of course, we try to get to the early date. We're trying to get this railway open in February, but it could go to June if we have certain factors that affect us in reliability growth, software development. So end dates are deadly. And I think for every mega program leader, the ability to manage the early date internally and the external date publicly, the longer date publicly, is one of the art of major program management. And I know it's difficult with politicians and people's expectations, but it's absolutely crucial that in the world of mega digital programs, we talk about windows of uncertainty and explain to people why that window exists, but drive the internal team to the early date. The other big lesson on Crossrail was, certainly my time doing this, the early date can't be a P0. It can't be a purely deterministic date. Otherwise, every single day you're losing. So our early date is more like a P15, P20, to give people a chance to win. The idea of a P0 early date is, I think, a bit flawed in such a difficult, challenging program. So number one, end dates are deadly. Talk about windows of uncertainty.
So are fixed budgets as well, by the way. And I did, and my colleagues, we did a power of work to try and get government announcements of projects to have a range of both of dollars and time. So easy for a politician to go, it's going to be 12 trains per hour on this line, and you go, has anyone done any of the technical feasibility or the costings on that? No. And you usually have to work backwards and try and massage it, or like it's only going to be a 20-minute train journey, and so then you have to try and work out, well, where are all the costs going, and you know that 20-minute train journey might mean the difference between a 20-minute and a say 22-minute, which everyone can accept 2 minutes, might be $400 to $1 billion, but it's also about understanding what that order of magnitude is. So yeah, fixed anything is really difficult, and that's where you need to understand a great understanding of risk, and you really need to understand how you plan and design these things as well.
How is what he was talking about any different to an early and late finish date, or is it more public perceptions of those dates that he's discussing?
Yeah, it is more of the public perception of those dates. Like a lot of the time, I'll say Melbourne Metro is going to be open on this date, or the Melbourne Metro is a year ahead of schedule, and you go, hang on a sec, how'd you manage to save a year on your schedule? Surely you think through all these things, and a year is a big thing to find in a schedule. So yeah, I know I've worked for some private companies that if a project manager delivered his budget significantly under budget, they'd probably get sacked because they asked for too much money.
Could be investing in something else.
Yeah.
It's embarrassing to go
Yeah.
ahead and say that to say.
Yep. Yeah.
To say.
But then at the same time, that can drive a lot of conservative behaviours, and people just spend to the dollar. So they buy stuff that you really don't need. Yeah. But it fits within the budget, so it's okay. That's where assurance is important. How are we going for time? Or are we okay?
Yeah, I think we're on track.
Yeah, good. Lesson 2 is a good one.
Let me
as
show
well.
you how we do stuff around here. Actually, my department uses Monday.com, so I'm good. Work now.
Some physical, they all end up in 250,000 assurance documents. Crossrail system engineering architecture has been replicated around the world. It's world class. We've got a classic B model. There are 16 million assurable elements of Crossrail, some virtual, some physical. They all end up in 250,000 assurance documents. 250,000, 250,000 assurance documents here that sweep up 16 million assurance artifacts. So the system engineering is absolutely sensational. The thing that was missing in Crossrail was system integration. And to me, system integration is almost contact sport in a positive way. It is the ability for people to work really together to create something and remove friction and interdependency. Crossrail created 37 individual procurement contracts in 2010. For certain reasons for the market at that time, it was broken into smaller packages than maybe some of you have out there. That was okay, but it created many, many multiple interfaces where people at the tactical front line were dependent on everybody else. And I guess my big learning at Crossrail in this area is that system integration has to be centralized and controlled. So for example, we bought the train 2 years after we purchased the signaling system. And we never really integrated the train and the signaling system together until we created, in my time, plateau teams, configuration control. So the idea of system engineering being essential, with system integration being absolutely fundamentally what we've achieved. So this is system engineering, system integration is important. And intrinsic in that, Crossrail was trying to deliver the end state on day one, the full cathedral with the stained glass windows and all functionality, all bells and whistles. And one of the first things I did in 2019 was to create a minimum viable product that could be scaled up. You don't start with iPhone 10, do you? You start with iPhone 1 and it gets scaled up. So why would an infrastructure project of such digital complexity be any different? So we created a minimum viable product, and that's all the genre of system integration. People will say on this call, I'm sure there's worry about the system integration department, but is it central to your thinking? Is it around the top table? Is it with the COO, the CFO, the CEO, the program director? Is system integration and the art of it central to the mission? And I think that's a key lesson.
Yeah, that goes to your point before. And it is really important. So that's understanding what are all the moving pieces. Moving pieces create risks. You should even think about mapping your risk, and you can do this. There's software that can do this onto your schedule, and it gives you your sort of tornado diagram of what's the risk that's coming up in your program, and what should you focus on this week versus next week versus another month. The human brain can only cope with so many inputs. You can only cope with so many things. But that's where it's important to go. Where am I at to? How can I focus on the right risks at the right time? Don't just look at the risk register and go, oh, there's a lot of risks. I'll just focus on the big ones. No, you focus on the ones that are more immediate. Any more questions on that one? No?
Just a thought, like that you have an MVP in this kind of projects is kind of like quite challenge, I would say, because usually MVP could stay only there and people doesn't really develop, like at least in software, I would say like when you're developing something and you have an MVP, could be like the MVP is enough and just stop here, and then you have like a waiver, and then you have like some deviations, and then you need to deal with that in the future. I don't know how could be that in this industry.
It happens all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah. So they might deliver the rail infrastructure. Usually it's around the signalling or the electrical systems. They think about, what's the amount of power that I need to support a minimum amount of trains that are going through, and if I want to up the number of trains in the network, then I need to think about power, but then signalling, because signalling becomes very important, because signalling determines how close you can have those trains together, and that's where the different technologies need to scale up with that. So MVP would be a very basic signalling technology, and then if you're looking at getting much more trains per hour, that's why they always talk about trains per hour, you need to have the scale it up from there. Usually the complexity isn't in laying track, isn't in the physical infrastructure, it's in the control systems, it's, signalling and power. and the integration of the different engineering disciplines. Good question.
Yeah, it's just because of all the lessons you can see in agile methodology. But
Yeah.
for me to apply agile methodology in such a big complex is really difficult.
Yeah.
I really don't know because you just don't have like this uncertainty, like you can really deal with these windows. And usually, for example, if you have like an uncertainty in one phase, you can have like a plan B. For example, I don't have this system, but I can mock up like the information. I don't know how you can really do that in practice.
Yeah, well, I guess it's just what is the minimal expectation that people have of a project or an asset that they're going to use. Like there's many differences in train stations. It could just be, you know, like a rammed earth platform. You wouldn't have that in a metro situation, of course, but versus, you know, a steel section versus, and then you keep on thinking about it. But then you also, because it's such physical infrastructure as well, it costs money to take out what you did before and put something new in. And you certainly don't want to do that too many times. I think they've already done it to Sunshine Station twice, and they're already thinking about it the third time for the new Melbourne Airport Rail. So, but it does happen. They had a minimal viable product in for Sunshine Station, and then they're iterating. It's expensive though.
Yeah. Usually when you
Yeah.
Would you say that you should always provision for your minimum viable product to be your end case then, in terms of physical infrastructure?
You should always understand what the costs are and the options are associated with that. And that goes right back to the optioneering at the start of the project as well. Because you're considering different options because you're trying to think about, what will get me my benefits with the easiest way to get there, or the most political or community expectations to get there. But all of that has a cost in terms of, well, what happens if things change? So a great example is in South Australia, they had a minimal viable freeway. Anyone heard about this one? No? It went one way. It changed direction depending on the time of day. It went north to south. And I think only recently they added another direction. So there you go, minimal viable product for a road. It saves a lot of money, but then also I'm sure it costs a lot of money as well, because when it came to upgrade the road.
But that's like a good example, because sometimes you have like the MPP, and
Yeah.
then when you need to redo you basically need to redo the project.
Yeah.
You need to go to the next step.
Yeah, yeah,
So it's costly.
yeah. So always allowing for what potential future scenarios are is a really good practice in project management, and any good business. But it's often not necessarily funded because people are dealing with today's problems, and they think that, well, that might not ever happen, or that's a problem for another. They kick the can down the road. But then when they kick the can down the road, it costs a lot of money. So that's where a lot of governments used to reserve land for freeways when they developed suburbs. You don't see too many land reserves these days, and they know that they're going to need a freeway at some point in the future for those communities to thrive and not be gridlocked. So again, thinking about the future.
Do you have the opposite problem though? You were talking about provisioning for future changes. I spent some time working on the airport rail, and they designed the whole thing for the high capacity metro signalling, and then there was a lot of discussion about whether to revert back to the traditional signalling, but none of the infrastructure was, especially in the viaduct, could put that infrastructure in.
Yes.
Should they, if your traditional signalling, say, is your minimum viable product, should it have been designed to the minimum viable in the first place?
Well, yeah, it's a good question, and one that government has been grappling with for a while. I I would suggest, and it's what happens as well, is that you need an overarching strategy, and you need to understand what the uses of your network, rather than necessarily one corridor or the other, are going to do, and then work out what is your transition plan to get you all those corridors into the similar, into the right frame. So you're trying to minimise the amount of technology that you have in any one network. So you're not trying to maintain, 12 different systems, for instance, which is hugely costly. You need to simplify that and try to aim towards having as minimal systems as possible, because it's easier to maintain, easier to get parts, it's more supported. Yeah. So it is a good question. And the project people are often they just want an answer. They don't care what the answer is, they just want to deliver it.
This is really the curse of the project itself, right?
Yes.
That's where you draw the boundary, and I mean, the first 2 points talk against having an overarching kind of umbrella, right, that brings the projects together.
Yeah.
So,
No, definitely, and I should say that, and I've seen this in the private sector as well, that the project moves at a much faster pace than the rest of the organisation. So waiting for the organisation to come up with design standards or a decision on something that will fundamentally affect their business is hugely challenging and really slow. And what often happens is the projects just race ahead, put in the technology that they think is suitable, and then in the future they worry about whether it is suitable. And that can often lead to stuff being pulled out, put in. Yeah. Because the organisation doesn't necessarily, rather than the project, have the same level of resourcing or the same time pressures. This one is one of my favourites as well, design modularity. And I've left a link at the back of the presentation to a document that I wrote with my team that's all about off-site construction that goes into the ins and outs of that as well. So let's see what he has to say about design modularity.
And we're back. The team is looking down the barrel of a 4:55 meeting.
Third point is design modularity. Unfortunately, not only was Crossrail disaggregated into 37 individual contracts, they were all highly bespoke. Hardly any modularity, plug and play. Almost all of Crossrail has been built in situ, tested in situ, commissioned and integrated in situ. Instead of building things in factories, testing them in factories, bringing them to site and plugging them together like modules. So the design modularity of Crossrail was really lacking. And that occurred because the procurement flowed a lot of requirements expertly into the supply chain, but gave too much latitude for tier 1 and tier 2 contractors to have different pumps, different CCTV, different protocols, different interface protocols. So design modularity, if I was at the beginning of a mega program now, Antis delivered HS2, phase 2B I think, I would be all over modularity. Could we build this in a factory somewhere and bring it to site and plug it in? And that would have saved a lot of grief on Crossrail, particularly at the end, when, as you all know, getting to this infrastructure, 9 central stations in Crossrail, all of them are 10 stories deep in one of the world's most complex cities. Trying to test and commission something in that environment is very, very hard. So I think for everybody at the beginning of programs, design modularity is the key. My classic example on Crossrail are doors. We all know how complex doors are on underground stations. We created an environment where the architects could create bespoke holes that would then go and buy doors. We've got thousands of different shaped doors in Crossrail. Instead of saying we'll have 10 doors, and the architects can make the station look beautiful around our 10 standard modular doors, all of them with the right fire damping, the right contacts, the right fire hardness, the safety certificate. 10 doors manufactured by 2 or 3 manufacturers. There are 10,000 doors on Crossrail, and a lot of them are different. So design modularity, number 3 lesson for me.
Yeah, hugely important because it helps to reduce the complexity of your project as well. It not only from a design perspective and a reuse perspective, if you start with a standard design, you get the feedback from installing it, from using it, and then that standard design evolves over time and creates this excellence of doors, for instance, rather than if you have variability in that and you let contracts or people design things from the first time and time again. That learning process is very slow, and you don't get to that superior door, for argument's sake, for a very long time if you ever get there. So that's where design modularity is really important, locking in your design and thinking about the simplicity of it. So how do you make it simple to design? How do you make it simple to install? How do you get it to site so it's simple? And making sure that people know how to operate as simple as it can be, I think is really important. I mean, we've all probably seen stuff and go, why did they do it this way? Or why there are 20 different things for this one thing that should be pretty simple and standard? Why do we have schools, for instance, that have new schools that are different in each setting, when you could just have similar set classrooms? It's not like the classroom is any different or the objectives of teaching is any different. Anyway, any questions on design modularity?
It involves precasting as well?
Yeah, precast is an element to that. That's definitely the concrete. So for instance, a great success for one of the more recent government projects is the level crossing removal U-trough design. It was hugely successful in terms of everyone agreed on the design, apart from maybe B1, but they later agreed on the design. They had some other issues that they were trying to work through. And everyone got pretty familiar with using them, and then the innovation came around, well, how do we install these U-troughs quicker? Or how do we add different features that can help us with maintenance or can help us install it better? Oh, it'd be great to have a lifting like there or something else there. You know, that the design evolves. Rather than a lot of the contracts, especially for government but also private sector, there's always issues around who owns the intellectual property. And this was something that I was pretty passionate on. I always firmly believe if you're paying for something, you should own the intellectual property. But a lot of designer or engineering companies would say, oh, I designed this door for you. That's my property, you're just going to use that one door on that project, that's it. You can't reuse it on every other project that you've got, which is a bit ridiculous. So it's just about how do you change that to suit. I've literally been in conversations where they talk about bridge design, and an industry representative will go, well, what if in another project they just take that bridge design and put it in a different location and the bridge doesn't work? I'm like, you can start off with the basics, but of course an engineer needs to think about the context of what they're building in. But you're not allowing people to start off with the basics, so you're getting a different, similar type bridge design in all different scenarios. You couldn't understand how that was not a risk, and how that the original designer of the bridge could be expected not to take the liability for someone building a bridge that they had no control over. Yep, up to that.
Is modularity always a more efficient way to go, or is it?
No, not necessarily. It's not. You might only have a need for an asset once, and so it makes sense just to do that once. There really is economies of scale as well, especially if you're talking about off-site construction facilities. So it really needs to be thought of in terms of the pluses and minuses. Though saying that there might be parts of your design that would be great for modularity and parts that don't make any sense. Like if you're going to do concrete footings on site, for instance, and it doesn't make sense to do it in the factory. So it needs some intelligence and logic to be placed. We'll go, okay, what should we consider, and what can we make modular versus what not. All that's explained in a document that I wrote as well, so it's pretty easy to have a look at that. Any other questions?
Maybe, so I don't know how much you looked in this project into this, but how did the business models of the companies change around that? Because, you know, it implies building a factory, and then as a company owner, I would now start calculating very quickly, you know, how is my operation?
Yeah, well, Crossrail didn't do it for this one, but I've been talking to the modular off-site construction industry for a very long time. It really depends. I'd say the industry in itself has had some huge successes, but also some huge losses. It's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. They want the scale, but then they don't have the scale, so where do you start? And sometimes they're charging way too much for something that should be something simple. Like, I looked at a Fonzie flat for my backyard, and the minimum that would come out to in the market was something like 750,000. I'm like, what the hell? Just for a garage and for like an apartment above it, no way should cost that much. So I asked the CEO of the prefab Oz, I said, what's happening here? No wonder no one's being able to afford this. And he goes, yeah, we've got to work on that. But we'll get there. But others like Hickory, for instance, have done amazing things with bathroom pods. Bathrooms are one of the most complex things in some buildings. And being able to have modular bathrooms and just crane that into commercial construction is really neat. Otherwise, have a look at some of the Mace videos. Mace is a construction company in the UK. They've got some great videos on vertical industrial factories, where literally they set up a factory on top of a building, and then they go up. They keep on going up, and you can see it being built in a very quick time frame. And seeing how they do it traditionally, it's amazing in comparison.
And this assembly line that they have on top, right?
Yeah.
With crane and everything.
Yeah, it's amazing. And some situations where it makes a lot more sense to do this as well. So thinking about if it costs a lot of money to put a train out of service and, for instance, do replacement busing, then you want to try and narrow your construction time frame down as minimal as possible, because you've got other costs at play. So the cost of taking something out of service is more than the cost of construction. That's where you end up in scenarios like if they were to build over rail, for instance, down near Flinders Street Station, or extend Fed Square, then it's going to cost a minimum of $70,000 a square metre to build on top of the rail. That's to taking into consideration all the fire, life safety and operational aspects that need to occur. Or if you're to redevelop Richmond Station, which doesn't have any disability access, and it's a huge station that needs fixing, I think they've looked at it and the price tag comes into $1 billion. Yeah, because it's such a key station in Melbourne. It will become a lot cheaper when Melbourne Metro is delivered as well. Yeah. The next lesson.
Have you had your help today?
10 years of execution. Lots of people have worked on Crossrail for more than 18 years. They've had their whole career here. And in that big, vast time, a couple of lessons really that Crossrail didn't do well. It was perceived in 2008 that the biggest single risk would be driving the tunnelling 30 metres below London, probably the world's most complex city to drive in because of the archaeology and the skyscrapers and the complexity of London. It was perceived that tunnel and drive would be the biggest risk. and that was expertly done with only about 4 months slippage in 2013. The team thought that the major risk was over, and the M&E fit out and integration would be a lesser risk. Now clearly that has been proven to be wrong. So my big lesson in number 4, the shifting of time. Make sure that you are looking at the right risk at that moment. And the reality is the integration risk has been far greater than the TPM drive, far greater. Maybe it's by a factor of 10. And that was completely misunderstood. And the conventional project tools did not pick up or inform in 2015-16 the aggregation of system integration risk. Things weren't done. Dependencies between interfaces weren't properly resolved, which meant trying to pull together 250,000 assurance documents was an impossible task. Foresight, actually, we're using Foresight now at the very end of our program. If we had Foresight at the beginning, and in 2015-16, this aggregating risk of system integration was revealed to the leadership team, I think we could have saved a year and maybe over £1 billion. This program would probably still have overrun, but the lack of insight in 2015, 16, 17 of the real risk, the aggregating system integration risk, was a real problem. And part of it was the mindset of the team, civil engineering team, who thought they'd achieved the biggest risk of the tunneling drive. The same civil engineering team went on to the integration. So another key lesson of Crossrail is right team at the right time. Now this is very hard and challenging, and I don't know much about American football, but I do know and I've heard that they have certain teams come on for certain players. And really, you want your civil engineering people doing the tunneling drive and major civils. You want your M&E people doing the fit out, and you want your system integration people at the end. And unfortunately, that means over 20 years, you probably need 3 or 4 squads. And on Crossrail, we persisted with the same skill set, and we ended up with unfortunately, the management team didn't spot the aggregation of risk.
Yeah, it's so true. Right team at the right time, right expertise at the right time, the integration of all of them at the right time. And just like I was saying before, you need to understand that risk calendar going forward, knowing what's this week, knowing what's next week, month, 2 months, what's ahead of you. Any questions from that sort of comments from Mark there? No? Okay.
Do you see that capability development as an issue in the mega project? So the transition between teams as well, maybe moving from temporal different areas to different risk areas?
Yeah, I see that as a huge area for development across, a lot of different governments. I'd say Victorian government isn't alone there. It's traditionally how we hire people, how we use people. We set up these authorities or these project teams as almost as a silo, and we don't share the resources enough across the team. So in my oil and gas days, we'd have a matrix structure. So we'd have a technical discipline that we would report into, but we'd also report into a project team as well. Your HR and your admin and everything goes through your technical discipline, but then your project's responsible for your performance, how you're doing. And so that means that you get to share your experiences and learnings across the technical field, and then at the project field, that's where you deploy it. And you sit with your project team rather than your technical discipline. You hear what's happening in the rest of the project. You sit and listen. You get involved in the stand-up meetings, the what's ahead of you, those type of things, rather than just sitting with your technical people. Oh, I only sit with the planners, or I stick with the stakeholder people, or I sit with the civil engineers. Integration is really important, so you need to be aware of what's happening around you. And it's really important for people to incentivize people to work together. That's a challenge in any workplace or any work setting, university setting, group assignments.
It's coming later in the tutorial.
Some people, you know, just they only want to do their own thing, while others people, you know, you need to come together and work together, and that's a huge skill, and it's important. And that's where you get to lesson 5, the human element.
Dishwashers use water less. Add finish tabs, clean success. Like a boss. Save more water than the sink. And dishes cleaner than you'd think. Buy a Bosch dishwasher to redeem bonus finish.
Some integrated the team.
Oh, sorry.
The 5th element to me is the most important, and it's transitioning from collaboration to something higher. And the higher order thing I call owning the whole. We've actually on Crossrail transcended to a world now where literally the tier 1s, the tier 2s, the tier 3s, the system integrator, the team, the train builder, the internal team, the delivery partner, Bechtel, Nichols, Jacobs, we've decided to own the whole, i.e. everybody's success or failure is the interest of somebody else, rather than like a collaborative spirit. We've tried to own the whole together, and the only way you can own the whole is by being completely transparent and having line of sight, removing false screens, spotting the gaps, encouraging people to say what is missing, because we found once the gaps and the missing elements have become transparent and visible to a cadre of people who are owning the whole, they can achieve great things. And the success over the past 2 or 3 years of Crossrail has been a group of brilliant people who are largely the same people, a few changes at the top, but they're largely the same people. The difference is they have transparency to the mission.
Yeah. Again, human element, so very important. How do you work with people? How do you incentivize them to help you out? Because you have dependencies, you have knowledge gaps. You really need to come together as a whole team to be functional and to deliver. So many times I've seen people hoard information, not tell people deliberately about what's coming up that they should be aware of. You know, a whole lot of negative behaviours that only comes out to hurt the outcomes of the project or what you're trying to achieve. So much better to let people talk to people about what issues or risks you're seeing, even if they don't want to hear it at the time, but you let them know, you document it, you say it's your decision to make, but this is what I'm saying, and most of the time they will realise that you're trying to help, or they might be dealing with their own stresses and risks and, you know, the challenges. They might have something that's a bigger priority than what your priority is. But it's important to collaborate.
By your experience, how do you think, because the human element is very abstract, so it's difficult sometimes to like have something that's going to work. So considering your experience, how do you create this sense of ownership in the people? Like, because usually they have only, you know, like one box, one package, and they are not worried about the whole thing. So, but they want everybody to know, like, there is a strategy here, we are together, we have like to collaborate, everything, and it's really difficult. At least what I see is really difficult to like to create this sense of, I say ownership because I want like everybody to know where we are going, where we are leading, and not only like what you need to do. Like.
Yeah, it is hugely challenging, and I'd say in the context too of a challenging mental health aspect to the industry as well. Like you can see all the stats from white collar workers in this industry that it is hugely challenging. There's long hours, often long hours. Hopefully we can change that. There's often huge stresses. There's often adversarial type relationships, and that's driven through the contracts. It's driven through the need to make a profit. It's driven through a whole lot of things. So it's like, well, how can you wind that back so people can have a safe environment where they can talk to other people, they can trust each other, and you'll often see that it's a lot more functional in an alliance type contract. So it's funny how delivery models come to play in on the human side of things rather than a fixed design and construct type contract, which was fixed at a certain point in time when you didn't know all the variables. First time you're delivering this project, you didn't know that there was contaminated soil there, or there was all these other challenges that you were going to face, and though you're expected to wear them. So that can cause a huge amount of the human side to break down. So it's important to create the environment where people can be as much of themselves as possible and deliver on the job and trust other people and work collaboratively and celebrate milestones and successes. And I'd say build a culture that if there is problems, that it's not blaming individual, that they're blaming the process, and they're thinking about how can they fix the process rather than sack that individual. Yeah, really important in terms of project management delivery, and often not really spoken about too.
One question.
Yeah.
Yeah, regarding with the human element, in the big project, usually in my place we hire the contractual people, contractual employees. So we don't have enough time to build the culture. But when we run the project, sometimes there is a silo mentality, right? So in your previous experience, how do you usually the practical way to deal with the silo mentality? So sometimes this person want to be the irreplaceable person, so they give information, and other ones do the same.
Yeah.
Everyone do the same.
Yeah, well, I think that's understanding human psychology as well, but also putting things in contracts to break down that as much as possible. You can't do everything in a contract, but you can try and do it as much as possible. Where are you from? You said where are you from?
Which country?
I'm from Indonesia.
Oh, Malaysia. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes, and delivering projects in different countries also has different cultures as well, which can play into things hugely. Like I've been dealing with the Japanese recently, and very different culture from Australia, and the human element is very hard to get going there. There's a hierarchy in how you deal with Japanese. So they're very respectful to their elders. Like it's only the person in charge who says something in the meeting, not the underlings who might see a risk or see something wrong. So it's understanding those human dynamics and trying to work through that as much as possible, and recognising that it is there. You're not going to change culture to a large degree. But you can make things a little bit more collaborative. So working in a contract sort of situation, make sure that there's shared accountability as much as possible. I mean, government says it outsources risk, really. Does it outsource risk if it's giving $2 billion to someone in a contract for delivering Melbourne Metro? Risk, at the end of the day, still it sits with the owner. The contractor does take on a fair degree in terms of balance sheet, delivering something and holding something up, sort of what can they be prosecuted in a sort of court of law for not delivering, but at the end of the day the owner still has a large degree of the risk, so don't think just by contracting it out you're going to get rid of it. Having mature understanding about that and the governance structures to manage that and take joint accountability over that, and making sure that it's at that senior level and right down throughout the ranks as well, in terms of making it as collaborative as possible. So you don't see the contractor and the owner as two different entities. It's just one project team working on it.
Yeah, but actually, previously I was working at a project outside my country. So it was a petrochemical project also actually.
Yeah.
And the company hired employee from around the world. It's coming from America, also Asia, Europe, and it's a mixed culture, and that kind of culture disappear. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe many people want to compete each other, but I think it's very, very common if you work with the various kind of people, silo mentality, something like that can happen. Yeah, regardless the culture of the origin country.
Well, I think work to what people are personally motivated to in projects, and I think a lot of personal motivation comes from actually seeing something being built. So how do you gear your team around doing that as most efficiently as possible and setting up the right incentives and KPIs and KRAs as well to make sure that you're doing that as effectively as possible?
I mean, we had here recently actually a similar research project, and the solution was about bringing the teams together, and we played actually lean games with them. So we had a big room concept, you know, at the beginning you would meet with all the teams, and then you had the parade of trades, so who is doing what work package, talking about workflows and who your teams will be today on site, and it can break the ice a little bit initially. Ideally it really gives you a workflow and kind of takt times, but
And it is nice.
yeah, but so here in the partnership that we work with, it seems to work, so that's the magic,
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, good. We have two more
Oh,
minutes maybe,
okay.
so
I'll see where there are just some other examples, and then there's some links in these to these documents as well that might help. These are just some of the things that I've been working on to improve how the Victorian government delivers on its projects at a whole of government level. So we've got the digital asset policy, which is all about change through technology. How do we get better use of digital technology in our projects? Massive. Like how do we better use our data? So, for instance, thinking, things like government spending $210 billion on infrastructure. It needs a lot of quarried product. It's responsible for the planning approvals for quarries, for new quarries and extending quarry life. It'd be good the data to be connected there so that it understands how much of that quarried product is needed when, so that it can influence the planning decisions or hurry things along or slow things down if need be. So thinking on through that, just one example, and thinking about how many other examples you can get just from the economies of scale from delivering an infrastructure pipeline, let alone having 3D technology to better deliver on things rather than using. I still see design reviews done with 2D drawing. Risk, time, cost and contingency, project controls, fundamental to delivering projects better. It gives you the eyes and ears and actually what's happening on a project. Off-site construction, we talked about, modularity, and of course sustainable investment guidelines. So how do you turn like the UN sustainability development goals into something practical that a project can do to help improve its sustainability? And thinking that concrete is 8% of the world's emissions, 8 or 9, and steel is another 8 or 9% of the world's emissions. So there's a lot of emissions just from steel and concrete, and there's a whole lot of steel and concrete that goes into civil infrastructure projects. So there you go. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can we say yeah, so you have today the tutorial with Omar looking at your assessment, so this comes later in the tutorial. If you have some quick questions, because we have to hand the room over again, maybe we are around the entrance, so if you want to ask Luke any questions, we will be there for another 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's fine,
and then I see you guys later if you want to kind of run to the tutorial, but for questions come to us. Yeah? Okay, super, thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you, Luke, for brilliant.
That's okay.
It's just out. Last weekend was my guest and then all I got in trouble from my colleague.
I
So
bet you
that's
did.
a real story.
Yeah, we have to have an election data clear. Yeah.
No, but it was super. So I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Oh, that's good. It's always hard planning a lecture and going, well, what do they need and what do they want to hear?
Perfect. Okay. This is me. Thank you. Yeah. Are you good?
financial management.